So in this video, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show you how to get from this to this using this mastering chain. So we'll be getting the track mastered from beginning to the very end using plugins only. So this is in the box chain. The track you're about to hear is by my client. I mastered the track for him, and this is not the exact chain I used. I also used analog processors, but we are using his track with his permission to show you how to master tracks using plugins only, and it's possible to reach the desired loudness thankfully to one specific tool, and it's the Cedar Audio Adaptive Limiter tool. But I'm going to talk more when we get to that specific plugin. Now let's not lose any of the time and jump into the very first processor. So the very first processor I used is this tape emulation by Softube. So we're using tape. Why we're using tape? Because I want to get rid some of those harsh high-end, and you'll be hearing that this specific mix, as you heard in the demo, has a very harsh vocals and those harsh hi-hats. So the first thing in treating that is I'm using this specific tape. The settings I'm going to use is I'm going for type B. Since this really works for mastering, I tried using this multiple times and it worked very well. You can use B or C. A not really, sounds good for mastering, but B or C mode works great. I'm using 30 IPS time. I don't want to introduce a lot of saturation there, but I want to keep the amounts kind of subtle. Now here we have the high frequency trim, and I'm using it to gently attenuate the top end. So just a very subtle roll-off, nothing too serious. And using this crosstalk to bring up the low-end frequencies even more so they sound more fat. The next tool we are going to use within this chain is my EQ. Now why EQ? I definitely noticed that I can really bring out the kick, I can also attenuate some of the mud and bring out some of the sides, as you can see here. So this graph may look a bit more confusing to you, but I'll explain how this specifically works. So the first thing I did is I wanted to amplify the kick. Now notice that I changed this scaling from 12 dB to only 3 dB, so we can hear all the changes we're going to make. And remember, mastering is a very precise process, so this is why we're doing this. So we're doing here let's say a kind of a static boost, and we are combining this with this dynamic boost, which really brought out the kick. We're also using this bell filter right below this specific boost that I did here, just to control the bass, because when I was listening to this track, I noticed that I can amplify the kick, but I still felt like I'm also amplifying that low-end boominess that I didn't really like on this specific track. So this is what I'm doing here. Again, some of the static boost, and we are combining this with a dynamic boost. Super simple. Now we have here, I also noticed some mud around the 250-230 Hz. This is very possible in mastering, but not on every single track. And I'm also doing a very similar cut as I did for the low end here. Now we have this specific band right here, and this is why many of you question, because you're like, well, we don't have any information on the low end. We actually do. This is why I did an amplification such as this one. Now talking this is pointless, so I'll let you listen to some demos and hear what this EQ does. The very next processor is of course ProMB. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't use this all the time, so this highly depends on the master itself. So what I'm doing here, you notice 3 bands, of which one of them is bypassed, but I'm going to explain why. So what we're doing here is I started with my own preset that I have within my ProMB pack, and what I use here is the low-end punch preset, but I modified it a bit, because I wanted to keep the glue to my very lows of very subs, and I wanted to expand some of the kick range, since I felt like the master can really benefit of that punch, and this is the track that you really like to hear bouncing when you play in the clubs or maybe car or house systems. It doesn't matter really where, but you understand the goal. And how I set this up is I basically used this specific expansion band here, and I also used from band to this free mode and centered the slider around the kick range. This really expanded the kick and gave that like punch. So we're combining those two bands to make sure we have tight low end, but at the same time very bouncy. Now what this band stands here is this is connected to my de-esser afterwards, but I'm not going to use this. Why? Because I had to decide if I would like to de-ess using a ProMB or a specific de-esser. So this is what's mastering basically about. You have to decide which tools you're going to use. So you have to try both of them in order to make sure you end up with the result you're looking for. So at the end, I didn't stick with the Pro MB for this specific case. I went for a de-esser, which you're going to see as my next tool. I left these bands for the purpose to show you in this tutorial how I basically test between different plugins and which ones I'm going to use. And in terms of oversampling, I also use the 4x oversampling, and that's basically it. Make sure the level is the same. So yeah, this is again very simple thing to do. Next on the list, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, is de-esser, but I'm not using a conventional de-esser, and this is where people make a lot of mistakes. I'm using Wise de-esser, which is a specific de-esser for mastering, as it says here. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using this band to focus on the very top end. But keep in mind, I'm using this in mid-side mode, as you can see here. So we have the channel 1 and we have the channel 2. Now I'm independently processing the mono and the stereo information, since I felt like this is the perfect way I can treat those S's and make sure they sound natural and not robotic, which is usual case when you use conventional de-essers in mastering. This de-esser made sure they are very natural and they're also sounding a bit tamed. Let's monitor the demo before and after. Next processor, a bit of compression, a bit of tone. What a perfect way to use Shadow Hills Class A. Now this is not obviously the only compressor I use. I also use analog units, I also use many different compressors. This one fit the track perfectly. How I set this up is I bypassed the optical circuit. I didn't use it for this track since it didn't sound as expected. I used this discrete mode with very low ratio, 1.2 to 1, which is almost no compression, but it still compresses the sound. We have the slowest attack and we have the fastest release here, while also making sure I have this iron node selected. Now this depends on what you basically hear and how you want the master to behave and how you want the compressor to affect that master. Now you could go for nickel, which is their most transparent mode. You could go for iron, which amplifies some of the low frequencies. It also brings some nice character. Or if you want to go for steel, which really gives that bold sound and really makes the low end step out. I felt like the steel gave a bit too much, so I went for iron here. And this is basically what I did. There's also advanced processing that you can do with this, such as mid-side processing. You can do left and right, dual mono, but I'm also going to expand that in my upcoming mastering masterclass. This very fast, so I want to make sure I keep the length of the video as short as possible, so you can understand what I'm doing here. So in terms of gain reduction, I'm going maybe 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction, again on in discrete mode, no optical mode. Now let's monitor how this sounds. And one more thing, I also use the sidechain filter so I can keep some of the low end there. When it comes to stereo field, I always like to bring another layer to my tracks, especially to my masters. So what a better way than to use Dr. MS by Matthew Lane. Now within this plugin I went very simple. So I used this focused section right here to take some of the information from my mono channel and insert it in my sides. This is how we create a new layer here. So I took this range from let's say 140 to about 850 Hz and then injected that in my sides. And I also did a bit of stereo expansion there. Nothing too serious, but again, this changes this master a lot. So let's monitor the demos before and after. Now you remember that we use tape and we also use the de-esser to bring some of those harsh high-end down and make sure it sounds a bit more natural. But I missed some of that very top end. I want to add some of the air and also want to bring some attention to the vocal range and also those hats. What I used is this curve bender by Chandler Limited. Now I use this in mid-side mode, so I'm basically unlinking the channel, selecting this mid-side mode, and what I did here is I set the band to 20 kHz and I'm amplified for about 1 dB here, using this shelf filter, which sounds absolutely insane, and I definitely love this unit, and I use this unit as my analog unit, but for this video we're using the software version. Another thing I did is I put the band around 2.8 kHz, amplified 1 dB on the mono channel, which brings the vocals up, and I used the same band on the side channel but to attenuate. So we basically create more accent to the mono information so we can make it step out in the mix. And I'm using another thing on my mono channel, which is the band at around 70 Hz to amplify for about half a dB using shell filter. This also made the low end step up a bit more, and I made sure I gain match so we don't have any loudness differences. Super simple, but let's monitor the results and let me know if you can notice the differences or not. When using tools like this, it's usually possible to introduce some of the unwanted width to your low end. And this is why I like to follow all of these processors with an imager. In this case, I'm using, of course, the Ozone 5 stereo imaging. I don't use newer Ozones. I explained previously why I used Ozone 5. Now what I did here is I focused on 3 bands only. I'm not affecting the middle band, since in this specific process my intention is not to expand more, it's about control. So I noticed some of the width coming here on the low end that I didn't want, so I used this specific slider to make sure I center those frequencies and keep them very tight in the mix. And also use some of the expansion on the top end just to bring some of the highs and the hats a bit wider. This also depends. I usually tend to put this to the bit negative value. For this track it worked with the positive value, and yeah, you understand why I use this. So yeah, it's about listening. So now we can safely move to the following processor. I might get hated for this, but for this track I used a clipper. I used this standard clip. This worked for me since I could use a gold clip, which brings a lot of attention to those low frequencies, but since I already have this, I wanted to use standard clip, which is a bit more transparent clipper. Now keep in mind, I don't use clipping always. I basically rarely use clippers. But for this track, it sounded very good since I was able to round the picks and make sure they sound super tight and super punchy in this specific master. So the way I set this clipper is I went for soft clip pro mode. I didn't use any of the saturation since we already have a lot of saturation added to this specific master, and the mix was very warm before it arrived to me. And what I use here is I set my clip fader to -6 dB. This is the usual value I go when I clip, and then I like to bring more audio to the clipper so it hits that ceiling and that clip fader that I set. So I'm not using the clip fader to pull a lot down, I'm using this input gain to just trigger the clipper and get the desired amount of clipping. Now I'm not doing a lot, I'm just making sure I cover the very top where the kick, where the hats are, just to make sure I get a lot of punch there. So this is how it sounded before and after. The thing you have to understand about this clipping, I know you notice that the differences in loudness are not the same, and they're not the same because I didn't level match. I wanted to bring out as much loudness as I can for this track. This is what the client requested. So another thing about matching, you have to listen what the client wants. My client wanted this track to be as loud as possible. Now we have the most important tool within this specific chain, and the reason why this master sounds very loud. I'm not using a conventional limiter. Of course, I'm not using Pro 2, I'm using Cedar Audio Adaptive Limiter 2. Now, this limiter is something I never experienced before. I work with the analog limiter. This limiter is something I just can't believe it exists. When I got introduced to this limiter, I was of course skeptical, but once I tried this and heard how loud and how clean it can keep the signal and get to the desired loudness, I was basically mind blown. Now I'm going to explain how some of these controls work and how you can get the same loudness using this specific tool. And I would highly recommend getting this plugin. Trust me, this plugin will change forever how you limit any of the signals, especially masters. You'll be able to hear why. So This limiter looks pretty straightforward. You have the threshold here, which you can basically adjust how loud you want your master to go. You have the ceiling. Usually I keep the ceiling at minus 0.3, 0.5, minus 0.7, minus 0.1, minus 1. It depends from master to master and the platforms the client is going to upload this master to. So I'm not working with a single version of master. I always make multiple of them, of course, depending on what the client wants, or if I'm doing the single file mastering, or if I'm doing stem mastering. You also have the quantization here mode if you want to export to different bit depths, and you can do a lot of manipulation there. And we have the spectral knob, this low frequency, and the high frequency, and we have the oversampling and the bypass. I almost always keep the oversampling on since I want to make sure I get the best quality and no other artifacts at all. But when it comes to these three controls, this is where this limiter gets different and why it sounds so loud. So before that, we have this attenuation profile right here that you're also going to see how it works when I play the audio. So the attenuation profile is constrained in two ways basically. The rate at which is permitted to vary in time and the amount by which is permitted to vary from frequency to frequency across the spectrum. So the action of this adaptive limiter is shown by the basically two lines, the orange and the blue one, on the display. So the upper line will show the minimum attenuation at each frequency within the small temporal window, and the lower line shows the peak attenuation at each frequency with a small temporal window. This is super simple and you'll be seeing how this works in action. But you see this spectral knob right here, and what the spectral knob does, so basically as you increase the spectral knob, you're allowing the attenuation profile to change more from frequency to frequency. So when you do that, the lines may develop more bumps as the value increases. So basically you're separating yourself for working with the conventional and this adaptive limiter. So if I switch this value to the negative value, I'll be basically emulating the conventional limiter, the regular limiter. But as much as I pull this to the right, I'll be triggering this adaptive limiter too, and I'll be getting more natural sounding limiting and more loud sounding limiting. And you also have separate controls for the low frequencies and the high frequencies, which is directly linked to this spectral knob right here. You can adjust this to your taste. So for example, if you want traditional limiting, this limiter can do that too. You can just put this value all the way to the negative, low and high to the 0 or even negative, just to make sure you get the conventional limiting. But if you want this adaptive and more loudness and more control over your limiters, which I believe you all want, and I personally wanted, I use this spectra to about +6. I could go even higher, but this is like the blend between the amounts I listened. I went for 4 on both low and the high frequencies. It's as simple as that. So now let me show you the demos and why you should definitely get this specific limiter. This mastering video is all about this specific processor, and it wouldn't sound as great as if it wasn't with this limiter. You can use any other limiter and have a great mastering tray as they have here, and the results won't be the same. But when you have the best tools such as this one, the master just sounds insane. So now I'll let you listen to the results and let me know what you think. So there you go. You asked for this video, I made it possible, and keep in mind that this is not the only way you can process your masters. There's a ton of science behind this, and why I use specific parameters, which I didn't explain in this video. If I had to explain this, it would be a, let's say, 48 hours video, or maybe even more, 96 hours. So the key here is for you to understand the importance of using great tools and also a great limiter or maximizer, such as the Cedar audio adapter 2. I'm going to mention this multiple times, but make sure to check this limiter out. You won't regret at all. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you find it super entertaining and useful. This is the part of my mastering masterclass that we're currently working on. We're going to explain mastering in very details. So the next question is, when is this Masterclass going to drop? Around the next year. So we're making sure we cover a lot in that Masterclass, starting from all the way up from ground zero, so as a beginner, all the way to being able to get as loud masters and basically crush the scene and make commercial sounding tracks. So that's about it for this video. Thank you again for watching. Make sure you check the Cedar Audio Dovetail Limiter tool. Definitely amazing tool, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Make sure you hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel and share with your friends, because I definitely believe someone could benefit from watching this video. No one would actually do this for you to share a full masterclass like this, but I did and I don't regret at all. In return, I would just like you to subscribe and make sure you support the video with a like. See you in the next video.